We need to fucking fight back. But against whom? Who are the bullies in this story? Ultimately, they're the banks, the big banks, the central banks, the hedge funds. They are the owners that George Carlin talked about. And they own the corporate DNC. They own the CIA. They own the deep state. They own Hollywood. They own the tools that they use to oppress us. The puppets on strings. They own the military. They own the police. They own the mercenary thugs that they use to do the quiet stuff. And yet, like bullies everywhere, they demand civility from their victims. Nancy Pelosi and the DNC are excellent at this. Make no mistake, they are thugs. They are absolute thugs. They demand that we be polite while they rip us off. And they're ripping other people off in other countries. And they're bombing the shit out of them. But more subtly, they're ruining them economically. All over the world, the United States is ruining other countries economically. The United States are not the good guys. And we citizens of the United States are complicit. We don't pay enough attention. We don't get off the beaten track in terms of news media. But our ignorance is still not excusable. The rulers use the two-headed snake of the Republican/Democrat duopoly to control us. And as Michael Hudson, the economist, says, victimizers always look at the victims as vicious attackers of themselves. It's the rhetoric of the bully. The bully always believes that the person he's attacking is a threat. So the people complaining about Bernie Bros, the people complaining about vicious attacks and incivility are the bullies. They are gaslighting us into submission. They're telling us that we are the uncouth, uncivil problem. But no, George Carlin had it right. You have owners. They own you. So let's not get caught in the civility trap. Let's pay attention to what they're actually doing to us, and let's fight back. Here's an article by David Sirota. Democrats in Washington are not just passively failing to mount an opposition to Trump, they are actively helping Republicans. And in their complicity with Republicans, they are actively helping our owners. These are bleak days for America's progressive movement. The Democratic primary process handed the party's nomination to the candidate with the most conservative record. Corporate-friendly politicians like the New York governor, Andrew Cuomo, are using the pandemic to brandish their images and install billionaires to run things. Progressive lawmakers in Congress are being steamrolled, even by their own party's leadership. Especially by their own party's leadership. And they are just rolling over and taking it. Sorry, David, I had to editorialize there. And a recession is battering the state and local budgets that fund progressive priorities like education and the social safety net. Perhaps this is a temporary stall-out. Don't believe that. Absolutely do not believe that. This is not a temporary stall-out. It's not a fleeting moment of retreat in a 2 steps forward, 1 step back trajectory. And I know you don't think so, David. After all, polls continue to show that from workers' rights to universal health care, a majority of Americans support a progressive policy agenda. But this is in no way a democracy. You have owners. They own you. They don't fucking care what you want. The problem is the good cop, bad cop system in Washington. As David says, the problem, though, is that Democrats in Washington are not just passively failing to mount a strong opposition to Donald Trump, they are actively helping Republicans try to fortify the obstacles to long-term progressive change well after this emergency subsides. They are fucking us right now. They are using this pandemic as an excuse to fuck us all over. This corporate counter-revolution is easiest to see in Democrats' enthusiastic support for Republicans' legislative response to the coronavirus crisis. Democrats' entire 2018 electoral campaign told America that the opposition party needed to win back Congress in order to block Trump's regressive agenda. And yet, when the Republicans proposed a bill to let Trump's appointees dole out government cash to their corporate allies with no strings attached, this same opposition party mustered not a single vote against the package. Not one. Thanks to that, Trump appointees and the Federal Reserve can now hand out $4 trillion to politically connected corporations as they lay waste to our economy and steamroll progressive reforms. Private equity firms and fossil fuel companies get new tax breaks as they buy elections and try to lock in permanent climate change. These bailouts were part of a larger legislative package that included good things like expanded unemployment benefits, and so you could argue that Democrats simply had to swallow a bitter pill and vote yes, except they subsequently proposed their own standalone legislation that would further strengthen the corporate opponents of progressive reform. For example, there is the Democrats' push to alter the so-called Paycheck Protection Program, PPP. Those loans were designed to help employees of mom-and-pop enterprises throughout the country. House Democrats' new stimulus legislation would open up the small business lending program to what they call small nonprofits, but their language was crafted to provide the forgivable loans to industry trade associations. Those lobby groups represent the planet's biggest corporations, and their political action committees have delivered more than $191 million of campaign cash to lawmakers in the last 2 decades. Democrats have pitched their legislation as a message bill. Fuck message bills. That just means they know it's dead on arrival. A message bill that declares their values. And in this case, they are reassuring Washington power players that money meant for workers at neighborhood restaurants, local shops, and other mom-and-pop concerns can be raided by the front groups representing giant drug companies, health insurers, and Wall Street firms. If the legislation passes, which it'll never do, but if the legislation passes, it would not merely be an epic tale of greed. The new funding stream for corporate lobbying groups would bolster the very forces that make sure federal policy disempowers workers, maximizes profit, and generally protects the ruling class. It's an even worse story on healthcare. As 43 million Americans face the prospect of losing private health insurance, Democrats had a huge opportunity. After Trump himself suggested he wanted the government to pay healthcare providers directly for treating uninsured COVID-19 patients, they could have called his bluff and passed existing legislation to expand a Medicare program that provides actual medical care. Instead, House Democrats passed a bill to support lightly regulated private insurance marketplaces and to subsidize existing private insurance plans through a Rube Goldberg machine known as COBRA. And they passed this giveaway just after receiving an infusion of campaign cash collected by insurance lobbyists. Taken together, these initiatives would route yet more public money through a corporate insurance bureaucracy in hopes that medical care eventually trickles down to Americans who desperately need it. Such a system is totally inadequate during a pandemic. It doesn't guarantee health care. It only guarantees insurance coverage, which is so often denied or restricted when a medical claim is actually filed. Moreover, corporate health insurance has far higher administrative costs than single-payer programs like Medicare, and even the much-vaunted Affordable Care Act allows insurers to siphon up to 20% of customers' premiums to corporate profits rather than actual medical care. But then Democrats' COBRA plan is not merely a financial bailout for insurers, it is also a political bailout when the industry needs it most. At a time when popular support for Medicare for All is surging, when even a Republican president feels the need to make rhetorical, if empty, gestures toward the concept of government-funded health care, the COBRA plan would use public money to firm up the private health insurance industry's dominance over the healthcare system just in time to short-circuit a Medicare expansion. That's probably why insurance companies have been lobbying for it. They know that such a program would boost their short-term profits, and they know that once such a program is in place, it would be politically difficult to get it repealed and replaced by progressives' far better Medicare for All program. In other words, Democrats' COBRA plan may secure insurance companies' profit-skimming position between Americans and their healthcare providers for decades to come. If you get the sense that the fix is in, and this is all deliberate, you're not wrong. Many of the self-styled progressive advocacy groups in Washington that posture as resistance leaders turned a blind eye to the bill's problems and endorsed the legislation shortly after it was introduced, undercutting progressive lawmakers off the bat. I don't even trust the progressive lawmakers. They have to fucking know what's going on here. Making matters worse was the theater on the House floor. This is why I don't trust the progressive lawmakers. During the debate over the Democratic bill, 9 progressive lawmakers made a public show of voting against the procedural measure to advance the bill, along with a tiny group of moderates. When it came to the real vote on actually passing the bill, a larger group of moderates ended up voting against it, but only one progressive lawmaker, Representative Pramila Jayapal, voted no. Had the progressives and moderates combined forces on either of the votes, they would have forced the bill back to the drawing board. Instead, their shenanigans ultimately helped secure the legislation's passage. That's actually what Bernie did during the first round of the stimulus bill. His shenanigans actually helped secure the bill's passage. Taken together, the spectacle was more confirmation that whatever resistance exists in the nation's capital, it is so often performance art rather than anything real. Outside groups and House lawmakers need to work together to build a populist bloc, probably inclusive of moderate Democrats and perhaps even an occasional Republican. I've said that before. Who will stand united to force votes to ensure that our economy does right by ordinary people, said David Siegel of Demand Progress, pointing to news of a potential Democratic coalition to buck the party's leadership and support a plan to float businesses' payrolls through the crisis. We must make sure that America does not go in the wrong direction and become even more inequitable because we let unemployment soar, compel cities and states to implement austerity, force small businesses to shutter, and let large corporations backstopped by the Fed roll them up. The tragedy is that we're already moving in that wrong direction, and chances to change the political dynamic do not come around often. As Barack Obama's former chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, now an investment banker and TV talking head, said more than a decade ago during the financial crisis, "Never allow a good crisis to go to waste. It's an opportunity to do the things you once thought were impossible." And this motherfucker is doing the things that he once thought were impossible. Billionaires and corporations are clearly following that advice, aiming to use the pandemic to grow their wealth and political power in previously unfathomable ways. It would be better if the opposition party put up a real fight, or at least refused to be complicit in postponing progress for yet another generation. On a related note, I was complaining on my Facebook page that Bernie's delegates are being muzzled. They are being forced to sign NDAs, and they're being forced to play nice at the convention. A lot of them see this as utter treason, and a lot of us are denied being delegates because we have Bernie or bust on our pages, on our Facebook pages and social media, and they know that we're rabble-rousers and that we're likely to cause trouble at the convention. Although it wasn't televised last time, there were a lot of rabble-rousers in Philadelphia. And Bernie is going along with the insiders he hired directly from the DNC who are still in his camp, and they are the ones who have prevailed. They are bound and determined to take the teeth out of the beast. One of my former students, who seems to be quite a reasonable suburbanite, told me in opposition, "If the campaign selects you as a delegate, you represent the campaign and the candidate. It's completely reasonable. In fact, the reasons should be obvious why they would require you to speak in public forums in ways that will not be linked back to the candidate in a way that could misrepresent or harm him or her. The campaign chooses its delegates to represent their candidate's platform. If someone isn't willing to do that, then the campaign should be able to choose someone else. Someone besides me, for sure. Personally, since Bernie has endorsed Biden, I feel a responsibility to avoid being critical of Biden in public forums. Fuck that shit. Even though I did not win a spot at the convention in the primary, I still feel that having campaigned and been on the ballot as part of his delegate slate, my words still have the capability of being used against Bernie. It comes with seeking and being chosen to have an official public role for the candidate. Andrew, it's much simpler than that. Bernie's revolution was starting to become unmanageable for the DNC, so they told Bernie's camp to tone it down. Bernie's followers made the mistake of believing it was an actual revolution, not merely a grandstanding ploy to bring more willing sheep into the corrupt DNC sheep shearing pen. The true revolutionaries will continue the revolution regardless of what Bernie tells them, and they will continue to mock others who meekly continue on the well-worn pathway to the shearing pens. But Bernie, I thought we were not going to suck up to corporate power this time. As it turns out, the deep state had a better grip on my balls than I realized. Then Andrew replies, which is fine for a random individual. That's me, I'm a random individual. But not for someone claiming to officially represent Bernie as one of his delegates in the Democratic Party. The campaign chooses the delegates. The campaign and the local party help get the delegates on the primary ballot. The primary voters determine how many and which delegates actually participate in the nomination and party position development. I know you know this, just making sure anyone else reading this understands it. The delegates are chosen to fight for the policy positions of the candidate, not for their own personal agendas. Delegates have to agree to that. This isn't a controversy. It isn't scandalous. It isn't bowing to the almighty DNC. It's not censorship. It's common sense. Common sense. If you accept a position in the campaign, you acknowledge that your public statements have consequences for the candidate and agree to keep those statements civil and consistent with the candidate's positions. Andrew, you fail to see the dual nature of this situation. Civility is just the facade. The beast itself is not at all civil and is about to burst out of its cage. We are at a crossroads. We are facing an existential crisis. You remind me of the comfortable, affluent people who decided not to take the lifeboats when the Titanic was going down. Insisting on civility at this time is crazy. The tipping point is coming where the desperate ones will finally make the comfortable ones aware that we are all well past the point of calm, civil, peaceful solutions. Yes, it is about the evil DNC who insist on civility as a tactic to keep their rule from ending. Many of us were intending to travel to Milwaukee and protest, perhaps in a civil fashion, perhaps not. Many of those who piled into the streets of Philadelphia last time, it was not televised, are even more amped up this time, and many are delegates who fully intend to go rogue if given the chance. Unfaithful is the opposite of what I'd call them, though. There is no morally defensible position for the DNC to insist on civility. Why? Because they cheated. They are still cheating. It is blatant. It is right out in the open. Anyone paying attention knows. They know. Bullies insist on civility for their victims. They have no intention of being civil themselves. Victimizers always look at the victims as vicious attackers of themselves. It's the rhetoric of the bully. The bully always believes that the person he's attacking is a threat. Well, in this case, he's right. We are a threat.